The next round of theories I really want to talk about here are systems and ecological theories. So we shall also try to speak about culture and decision-making theories, and we shall later be considering postmodernism. So we consider systems and ecological theories because they are quite interrelated. I thought it's quite practical to speak to them together. And you really have already general understanding of systems theory. You might have been considering this since your first year, and even ecological theory, exactly the same ecological theory we all learned from Urey, Bronfenbrenner. But the idea here is just really that systems theory sees organizations as made up of many interdependent parts or entities, and that these entities which make an organization are um, in interaction with each other, interacting with one another. Otherwise, the organization just becomes meaningless. So, ecological theory builds on this understanding by emphasizing the organization's relationship with its environment, its external environment, and it sees organizations as permeable or otherwise something which can be easily affected by what's happening around that organization. So these perspectives really come from biology, and just like organisms adapt to their environments, the key idea here is that organizations must adapt to its environment to survive. So if we can think about, what happened during the deinstitutionalization processes of the late 80s and 90s, we can see how, changes have been happening and really affected organizations in many ways. Services that were once provided by governments were, outsourced, and, private providers and community organizations took over. And we can see this playing out, maybe not so much in Australia, but if you look at other global South countries, we might see, what has been the impact of what was known as the structural adjustment programs, where services were just privatized, and, and services which didn't adapt to these developments simply disappeared. We can also look at this from the angle of COVID-19, which is quite the most recent global event. And you can think of how this has affected actually service delivery and human services organizations generally. Which services out there have simply stopped because of COVID-19? How were different, service arrangements, if we can think of service as systems, how have they been affected by COVID-19 in terms of the structure, but also, how this external factor had shaped the way services are, being developed and even, implemented. So we can also think of, something around the NDIS, which has experienced similar rollout in the recent years. And suddenly there was a huge growth in small organizations offering disability services. And now you see really a range of private providers engaging in the NDIS, and that's affecting actually the whole system of NDIS in a particular way. So hopefully these are quite clear examples of an open system adapting to environmental changes. And it gives us really an understanding of what we are really talking about when we consider ecological and systems theory, how the system, operates from the internal side, but also how it's being affected by external events. So the strength of these theories is that, they help us really understand how organizations evolve in response to external pressures. but also how they adapt to these changes, including, adaptation from in between, from inside the services themselves, and how, this might have implications to policy changes, funding shifts, and of course, adaptation to disasters and community needs, as we started discussing when we mentioned COVID-19. So these theories, like any other theories we have considered so far, carry limitations. They are criticized, for example, and some people would argue that organizations aren't simply living organisms like we are trying to describe here. They are made up of people, and it's the people who actually adapt, not the whole organization. So much see criticism like this about these theories. But again, it's just another way of looking at human service organizations. Other people might simply say that these theories don't pay enough attention to power and the power dynamics and how that, politicize and make human service organization an area of practice that's quite contested and even, politicized. So they can also seem quite apolitical because they are trying to take the organization, outside of the politics in which which organizations also really operate. Now, if we can think of, you know, which questions we would be asking when we are approaching organizational analysis from ecological and systems theory, we can think of different kinds of questions. We can think of questions like how do each of the different internal systems within the organization really relate to each other? Are they interdependent enough? Are they interconnected? What are the connections out there in the organization? And we can try even to take this to a more personal consideration in terms of who is interacting with whom, what are the relationships between different entities, how does the CEO, for example, interact with, I don't know, the direct practice team, or how does the clinical team interact with the administrative team. So all those are key questions which might help us approach the organization from systems theory and of course from even, ecological perspective. So we might also ask questions like, how does the organization adapt to survive? If we think, for example, of COVID-19, which is an example I gave, you will see many organizations have made changes and some are still out there today. We saw, for example, many organizations shifting to telehealth, for example. And now we have a lot of organizations thinking in terms of, virtual reality and all those kinds of sophisticated technologies. And these have been quite, adopted to adapt to the changes that were imposed to all of us by COVID-19. So that's a systems response, definitely, to what was an environmental challenge, an environmental constraint. Now, if we look at the Avalon case, having these questions in mind, we can see how, different organization, how this organization, the Avalon, is the organization we are referring to in this case study, can see really how it adapted to changes and challenges over time. It originally focused on mental health. It expanded to include services for older people and those experiencing homelessness. And these changes were driven by funding opportunities and community needs. And the organization actually set up distinct programs to adapt to these shifts. So, in the case of the Avalon case study we are considering here, system theories really help us understand how and why these adaptations occurred or were considered.